So for those of you that remember, last year we had a presenter from Arizona come and talk to us about groundwater management and successes there. And it was so well received that when we were planning this year's event, we decided to have a similar presentation. This year we decided to switch it up a little bit and do a panel discussion. We are extremely excited about this panel. Moderating is going to be Kristen Fancher, who is the founder and attorney at Fancher Legal. So please help me welcome Kristen and the panel to the stage, and let's give them a very big Texas-sized welcome.
Do we have assigned seating?
Right. Good morning, everybody. I am very pleased to be part of this panel today. We are so proud to have our fellow water industry stakeholders, but they're from other states. So what I'm going to do is provide a very brief introduction of them. I'm going to direct you to the program for their formal bios. So, but what I am going to do is provide you a little information you might not know about them from those bios. So first up, we have Sarah Houston. She's the executive director of Protect Our Aquifer out of Memphis, Tennessee. Sarah actually moved from Texas to Tennessee to Memphis to take this job. She was the first employee at Protect Our Aquifer. Next up, we have Don Christy. He's the executive director of the Yazoo, Mississippi Delta Joint Water Management District out of Stoneville, Mississippi. And something very interesting that some of you, I know a lot of you will be interested to hear, he has a 29-member board. And so for those of you that have large boards and I've heard about, I think Don has you beat. So 29-member board, and he actually has a board meeting right after this panel that he will be participating on through Zoom. So we can't keep him too long after this, during this panel. So we're happy to have Sarah and Don. And then lastly, our third panelist here, we have Aron Balok. He's a superintendent of the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservancy District. Did I get that? I got that right. Out of Roswell, New Mexico. And he was born and raised on a cattle ranch in northwestern New Mexico. So he is a little bit south, I guess, right, of where you grew up. But he knows all things about New Mexico. I know there's plenty of you that want to visit with him about his experiences, and we're excited to hear from him today as to exactly, what he can provide for us. The goal of our panel is to take lessons learned. They have some fantastic experiences, some tips, some things that, some, like I mentioned, lessons learned, some weaknesses, strengths. And so that's our goal for the Texas water industry stakeholders, for us to take some things to think about, and especially as we're going into legislative session, for us to be able to, have some well-rounded perspective. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and jump right into our panel. The first thing we're going to do is talk about an overview of their state's groundwater management, because in order for us to get some wisdom from us, as the panel is titled, we're going to need to know how their state regulates groundwater. So with that said, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you, and can you provide us an overview of how Tennessee regulates groundwater?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and hello and good morning, everybody. Tennessee is a lot like Texas in a lot of ways, where there's multiple climates, multiple geologic formations. So always got to start with geology as a water nerd. If you start out east, you've got a lot of karst formation, the Smoky Mountains. It kind of starts to flatten out a little bit in Middle Tennessee, but still mostly karst. And then West Tennessee is very unique. We're still part of that coastal plains region, and we have a deep, unconsolidated sediment aquifer, multiple layers as part of the Mississippi embayment. And that actually spans part of 8 states, which some of the thickest part being underneath Memphis, Tennessee. 100% of the 20-county region of West Tennessee relies on groundwater. All of our farming needs, industrial needs, municipal needs. So we are very different from the rest of the state. Now, spoiler alert, we don't really have management. So this will be a fun perspective I get to bring to y'all. But we do have this one act that kind of has the main statute and authority for any type of water management, and it's the Tennessee Water Quality Act of 1977. And that is actually what dictated groundwater as water of the state. So we do have that, authority of the state to permit wells and do things like that. There's only one county in the whole state that's actually taken up that offer. So Shelby County, where Memphis is, they're the only county that has a groundwater board and the authority to permit wells. We're the biggest user of the aquifer. We pump about 200 million gallons of water a day. Most of that is industrial users. But this groundwater board is a pretty sleepy entity. When Protect Our Aquifer was formed, we actually formed to challenge one of their decisions. They had permitted 5 deep wells to Tennessee Valley Authority directly across the street from their unlined coal ash pits. So there is concern with arsenic, lead, fluoride, and they're like, go ahead, pump 5 million gallons a day. I'm sure there's nothing to see here. And the common sense test kind of came about, and we said, maybe if you pump that much, you're going to draw down some of this contamination. So we formed up purely to challenge that. It took about 2 years, a lot of science, pump tests proved that the common sense test was right, and they're no longer allowed to use those wells. But that kind of started our whole journey into no one is managing this huge asset. No one is managing this aquifer, and the groundwater board only meets to hear appeals. So that's what we got going on right now in Tennessee.
You bet, quite a bit. What about you, Aron? Can you provide us an overview of groundwater regulation in New Mexico, please?
No. So my district is unique in New Mexico. We are a groundwater district, Artesian district. But we were kind of similar. We were born out of crisis. And so you'll hear me go back and forth between what New Mexico is doing and what we're doing in my district, because I feel like we're kind of leading at the leading edge of the curve there for groundwater management. The district was born, you all have heard the term conjunctive management, right? That was born in the Pecos Valley. And that was legislation that was passed out of desperation, because with the discovery of that Artesian aquifer, everybody was drilling wells. We were drawing down the aquifer, and we were saturating the soil. So we were really making a mess there. So they got legislation passed that says, look, we got a river here, we got groundwater here. This is like horses and horse manure. You can't have one without the other. So we're going to have to give the state engineer the authority to manage the groundwater. And so in doing that, they also created our district, the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservancy District. Not the longest name here, but we're giving you a run for your money. And so with that, we started actively trying to manage that resource. It's a tremendous aquifer. It's a karst formation. We have about 110,000 irrigated acres there. We follow that nasty prior appropriation doctrine, and nobody likes to hear it, and it's really expensive. It takes a long time. It's difficult. But I tell people, even in New Mexico, prior appropriation doctrine for groundwater management is like abstinence for birth control. It is 100% effective every time it's implemented. It just nobody wants to do that. So we led the charge in New Mexico. We got our basin adjudicated. We know exactly how many people have a right to take water. It's an absolute right. That is a private property right. There are no new appropriations from our aquifer. So, and we also did a novel thing, and we put a meter on every single point of diversion. So we know how much water is coming out. We monitor the levels. We know how much is coming in. And so that is literally what my board seeks to do, is balance that equation. And it's always in flux, and the state of New Mexico is now saying we can look forward to 25% less surface water. So now we're looking at ways that we can try and balance that equation as the equation changes.
Wonderful. What about you, Don? Can you provide us an overview of groundwater in Mississippi, please?
Well, our journey is a little bit different from both New Mexico and Tennessee. It's somewhat interesting to note that Mississippi was the only state east of the Mississippi to actually pass what most states in the U.S. would recognize as a prior appropriation doctrine for surface water use, actually, back in 1956, following a drought. But it only applied to surface water use, so it was actually never recognized by a lot of users. And we, of course, are a riparian state, and so the groundwater users in Mississippi continued to follow the normal riparian use in groundwater use in Mississippi up until 1985, when the legislature stepped in and decided to consolidate the law and made both surface and groundwater they decided to make it all of those waters are now waters of the state. So both surface and groundwater are all owned by the state. And in order to use water in Mississippi, with some exceptions, you have to come to the state and get a permit. Since '85, there were folks that were grandfathered in at that time for a 3-year period. People who were prior users were grandfathered in. And since that time, for my purposes at least, the Yazoo Mississippi Delta, we focus on agricultural use. And so we see about 25,000 permits for farming and catfish production, and so we're looking at that type of use. So we I guess that's
a great overview for us. Yes, thank you very much. So Aron, we'll transition over to some weaknesses, some things that your organization has faced, some challenges that you'd like to share, maybe that we can learn from that come to mind for your organization.
Well, I guess the one that comes to mind off the top of my head in our district is, I bragged that we invented that whole idea of managing groundwater because it's connected to the river and conjunctive management. And that came back to haunt us when Texas decided that they were actually entitled to some of the flows on the Pecos River, and we weren't delivering them. And they pointed to what we referred to as the northern expansion, where a bunch of wells had been put in on the northern end of our district. And they said, guys, you kind of, all that water you're pumping is causing no water to go down the river, so maybe you need to get a handle on that. So everybody loves to hate that. Took it to the Supreme Court, lost. I actually see that as a good thing. It put us on track. It made us do the ugly things we had to do to get in line so we could deliver. And so it was, in the long run, it ended up just being some pretty serious growing pains. But from a state perspective, New Mexico has got the framework to fix some of its groundwater problems, but it just hasn't dedicated the manpower and the resources. And you all know this, water issues aren't sexy. Everybody loves to talk about fixing water problems, but when it comes right down to spending the money on it, there's other things that are more palatable for politicians to get behind. So it's caused us to really struggle in some of the basins that are still open to new appropriations. One basin in particular, we share a border with Texas and Lee County, and they've got a partial meter order. So if they do something new with their water, they put in a new well and transfer water into that well, they have to get a new permit, then they're required to put a meter on it. But the other well that's across the way from it is not metered. And so that creates a lot of discontent. Why do I have to put a neighbor on when my neighbor isn't? And so I've actually had T-shirts made, they should be ready when I get home, with an image of a meter, and the caption reads, "You can't manage what you don't measure." And so I'm a big advocate of getting meters on wells.
We might need some of those T-shirts, huh? That'd be great. That's great. Dawn, what about you? Any weaknesses, challenges that you can share with us that we can learn from?
I guess the major weakness that we face is part of the process. We can't seem to get some of the process because it's ingrained in the law. We can't seem to get it updated. First of all, we've got our permit fee, for example, in Mississippi, and I know all of you will really appreciate this. If you come to Mississippi and you apply for a groundwater permit, prepare to get your pocketbook out. You will have to pay the grand total sum of $10. So, and it takes us more than $10 to, we can hardly turn on the electricity for $10. But we can't even go to the legislature and get them to change the law for that. So, we've got other things in the process. We have to send out things certified mail. We can't find people anymore, and we have to publish things in newspapers nowadays. Oh my Lord, I live in a rural area where they don't publish the newspaper anymore. I mean, the newspaper is out of business. So there is no daily newspaper. There is no weekly newspaper. And, there hardly is a newspaper at all. And there certainly is not a printed newspaper. And so, publishing something in the newspaper is practically impossible. So, so the process is something. Coping with the process, I guess, is a challenge.
You bet. I bet there's a lot of folks in the audience that can appreciate all those things. So Thank you for sharing those. Yeah. Sarah, what about you for challenges, weaknesses from your perspective in your organization?
Yeah, I really think I was invited here today just to make everybody feel better, because we really have a lot of weaknesses. It's all weaknesses right now. But thinking about a couple different points. One being, we've had our first ever state water plan in 2018. And it was really just more of an exercise to let's start thinking a little bit farther forward. And there were technical groups by surface water, groundwater, infrastructure, and technical needs. And they were all siloed. They all wrote up their own little report. And it's like, now it's a nice, pretty document. It's like, what are we doing with this thing? So we have some ideas for planning, but there's not really any momentum to really carry them out. So that's one big challenge, is just thinking about how do we really move management forward in Tennessee. But one thing that's really concerning for West Tennessee is that we have a very unmapped aquifer. We have a lot of like model generated images. We kind of know generally where the formation is and isn't. And the recharge zone band, it's actually the swath of West Tennessee that is really the only area where direct recharge occurs for the whole 8-state region. So this little 11 county sliver is really important regionally. And we got nothing going on over there. It's like, do what you want to do. And there's been some major contamination issues out there. There's had a whole town had to get off of groundwater because there was chlordane, dioxin, some really nasty pesticide chemicals from a 300,000 drum dump site that Velsicle put in back in 1970. So things like that is just kind of a hot spot going on. And mapping out the recharge zone is really critical to know, where is that recharge really occurring? Where's the edge of this confining layer? And where can we think about, more incentives for either land conservation, putting in farming easements, thinking about, more NRCS programming, really thinking about that infiltration component in this area. So that's something that we've got a lot of ideas and hope for, but we just don't even have this area mapped at all. And then I'll say, our water statute is very much focused on quality. You don't talk about quantity in Tennessee. No meters. How dare you? So we kind of have to constantly make the case that the two are connected. I mentioned the drawdown effect that we were concerned about near the coal ash pits. We're seeing major cones of depression underneath our municipal well fields in Memphis. Draw down up to 125 feet, and it's allowing this legacy pollution, pre-EPA regs, we just buried everything. You buried stuff and then we drink from underground. It's like it's a little bad equation we started. But the sands move so slow, we haven't had to worry about it. But we're reaching that point in time, 60 to 80 years now, where it's starting to catch up. And so we're seeing wells having to be shut down due to contamination. An entire well field and water treatment plant in a very affluent neighborhood outside of Memphis was shut down. They had TCE and hexavalent chromium contamination issues. So we're seeing this kind of like contamination thing happening, and we're trying to make the case like, hey, we need to really think about conserving and get some of our industrial users doing like single pass cooling water. You pump it and dump it. We can actually get some recycling and some, closed loop systems installed. But right now you have to really focus everything on quality and how that's connected to quantity. And that's like not a very easy thing to explain to laymen, much less decision makers, that, water, it comes out of the faucet. What were we talking about? Mm-hmm. So that's like an ongoing challenge. And I think what we're really trying to do at Protect Our Aquifer is kind of change that cultural mindset of like, this is a resource that is an amazing asset for Memphis, Tennessee. It's an amazing asset for West Tennessee. And we're going to be a very popular location in the future. We got a lot of water. We got the Mississippi River. Got this massive aquifer formation, but if we continue this unchecked, deregulated situation, we're going to see massive increases in treatment costs. We're going to see big issues with drinking water, health, safety. I could go on and on. There's a lot going on. So it's just challenging thinking about shifting that culture and mindset around why we need to manage water.
You bet. Well, thanks, thanks, Sarah. And Dawn, our next step is the brag moment. This is a time for you to brag. Tell us some things that have gone well in your state, your organization. Tell us some things you'd like us to hear, and maybe we can borrow from those moving forward.
Well, I think, we've had a number of things that have gone well. I mean, I think as far as things that have gone well, we have met the challenge of accomplishing getting a number of these getting people, a large number, if I were to show you a map of the state of Mississippi, you would see that we have, I guess, from a groundwater perspective, we have most of the groundwater permits in Mississippi are permitted in the Mississippi Delta for groundwater use, simply because that's where we're pumping water for agricultural use. Other areas of the state are pumping groundwater, of course, for industrial use, commercial use, but not nearly on the kind of scale that it's being pumped in the Delta. So the 1985 Act, I think, has been implemented well across the state, which I think there was a lot of trepidation when it was passed that there was going to be trouble in doing so, because people were concerned that, you know, I mean, folks were going to be pushing back on saying, oh, I've got to come and get a permit and to use water, and you know, and even today, I'll be honest with you, we still get a lot of people saying, no, I don't need a permit. This is my water. I don't need a permit to use water, and so I'm not going to get a permit. But you know, we've basically had good fortune, I think, in implementing the law and working people into the system, and in pushing this, in making the system efficient. I mean, even though we have a lot of permit applications come in, I have a small staff. I only have 6 people on my staff that process permits. And then the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, who is actually responsible for issuing the permits, has about twice that many on their staff. I mean, it's a very efficient system ultimately for managing the water use permitting process. So I think the water use permitting, now at Y&D, I have to, I guess, issue this disclaimer: we do not have any enforcement authority. So we don't go out and inspect people and make sure that they are doing something that they're supposed to be doing. One of the requirements that we have is that if you have a groundwater permit, is that you have to implement 3 conservation practices under your groundwater permit. So we do not go out and ensure that producers are implementing those 3 conservation practices. So that is under the purview of the State Department of Environmental Quality. So we don't undertake that role.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Very different than Texas, so interesting to hear that perspective. Sarah, what about you? What about strengths from your organization, your perspective, working in Tennessee?
Yeah, the little that we do have is pretty good in theory. We've got a lot of great words on paper. We got a lot of good ideas on what management can mean. Being that groundwater is a water of the state, that kind of at least gets in this shared resource idea. And the Shelby County regulations are one groundwater board in the state. It actually has authority over all aquifer formations. So it's very loosely called groundwater. So that's really helpful when we're thinking about like shallow aquifer contamination issues, the drinking water aquifer, the Memphis sands. So they can really kind of think about, well, in theory, they can think about the different usage of that. So that is like a really good strength because we know that there's water transfer between those formations. We know that they affect each other. So that's a good thing we have going. And one thing I think is a strength is because Tennessee is so far behind the times in this, is we really kind of get to like pick our own thing, pick our own journey. And I'm a big fan of One Water principles. Any integrated water resource management nerds in the audience? Yeah, all right. So, it's a very new concept, in Tennessee. But it's really thinking about, how do you follow the journey of that water molecule, whether it's through an urban water cycle or natural water cycle, and how are we thinking about efficiency and usage? And so that's a really fun concept for us to really start thinking about. And we have an opportunity to put it in practice a little bit down in Southwest Memphis, very industrial, heavily zoned area. That's where TVA's big gas plant is. They use about 5 million gallons of water a day, reliant on our municipal well field. And then there's a bunch of other industrial users, some with private wells, some on municipal water. But there's a lot of arsenic in the shallow aquifer. There's TCE in the shallow aquifer. So there's direct avenues for that to get in. Well, Mr. Elon Musk has decided to come to Tennessee, and he has opened up XAI, the world's largest supercomputer or whatever. And so it's a big old warehouse that has been vacant for about 10 years. And they need about 1.3 million gallons of water a day just for cooling the supercomputer. And there's space left in that manufacturing facility that I'm thinking something else is coming, but at least a 1 million gallon a day demand. And these facilities are all right across the street from one of our southern wastewater treatment plant. So we have been pushing for TVA for a long time to use recycled water. And they're always just dodging us. But the local utility is supportive of that. But then when XAI was getting recruited, out of the mayor's mouth and our utility president's mouth was, hey, you're going to be way more welcome to this community if you commit to using reclaimed water and help us build this facility. And I was like, oh my God, they're doing it. They're saying it. So, right now it's a lot of promises and ideas, but that's kind of where our advocacy is kind of staying, is holding them accountable and actually follow through on that. But that's an opportunity to think about groundwater management, reducing consumption for, non-potable needs, non-potable use. And where else could we kind of spread that idea? So I think that that's a strength that we have going, where we're thinking about, not just purely relying on the aquifer for everything because it's there. It's like there's other sources of water. And then lastly, I'll just say stakeholder engagement we find really critical. We really think that there's so many different diverse water needs and water users. How do you bring everybody to the table? And we're not going to all agree. Sarah earlier was talking about, the lack of compromise happening, at the state level is challenging. And so we have a big manufacturing plant called Blue Oval City. Ford's big EV, $6 billion plant is coming into town right outside of Memphis, in the aquifer's recharge zone, pumping 4 to 7 million gallons of water a day. And when that happened, it's all in a very rural area where there's no regulation, number one. But this is going to bring a lot of jobs. This is going to bring a lot of new growth, subdivisions, strip malls over the recharge zone. How do we think about One Water? How do we think about not paving over our sands, allowing for green infrastructure? So we decided to create West Tennessee H2O, kind of piggybacking off the state water plan, to bring everybody together. So we got, utilities, Farm Bureau, NGOs, state, TDEC, our TCEQ, all kind of meeting quarterly, being like, what's going on in your world? What are we thinking about? And we're starting to draft some letters together to send to local zoning authorities. We've got little, planning commissions in these counties, people that just sit on this board because they're on the soil district board, and now they're on this board. And so providing them some like, okay, wellhead protection overlay districts, this is a tool in the toolbox, have you considered this? And so we're trying to think about how these stakeholders can work together, find some compromise and agreed upon things that aren't getting right onto metering or anything, but thinking about some of these best practices. I think that's a big strength we have right now, that the community is excited about talking about these ideas.
Next steps, you bet. Aron, what about you? What are strengths with your organization that y'all have experienced?
Well, it occurred to me that I am here today because I am standing on the shoulders of giants. There were people that came before me that just had tremendous foresight. They recognized what they had, and then they did all of those tedious things that we needed to do to get to where we're at. So with my district, very thoughtful creation of the boundaries of the district that overlays our aquifer. And they did that for a couple of reasons, but mostly political, because they knew the state of New Mexico was going to throw a fit, given this authority to the state engineer. And so they said, you know what, the boundaries of the language in it says the boundaries of which can be ascertained through scientific investigation. Well, this was in about 1928, and no one else in New Mexico had had a hydrological survey done. So no one else cared. They're like, if you want to let the state engineer come regulate, go for it. And so they laid out that boundary, and the legislation that they got passed granted them taxing authority. And I think that's huge, because we're funded by a mill levy from the community. So we're not beholden to the state's whims when it comes to our budget. We have a 5-member board of directors. They're all active in the community there. They understand the issues that we're facing, and they've evolved over time. So if you're familiar with the adjudication process, it's a legal proceeding where the water right owner is the defendant. And I think it's just kind of a fun play on words that my district told the state engineer, if you don't sue us, we're going to sue you. And so we forced the state engineer to adjudicate our basin. In that adjudication came the meter order, so we know how much water is coming out. The district owns and maintains a meter on every single point of diversion, so that's not a hardship on the individual. And so it's allowed us to actually manage it instead of just talking about managing it. And then as time has went on, when the district was formed, we had the simple and laughable mission to conserve the waters of the Pecos Valley. And so as time has gone on, these very intelligent individuals who've served on the board recognize the needs of that community. We have a conservation loan program where we offer low-interest loans to producers to put in more efficient water practices. And I get a lot of pushback from the state on that, because they say, well, wait a minute. Yes, they're using the water more efficiently, but they're pumping the same amount of water, so one could argue they're actually using more water. And and that is our job, to facilitate what those producers do, and our farmers do it as good as anyone in the world. And they continue to produce more for the many with less. And so that's kind of, I feel like part of my job is to facilitate their ability to do that. I want them to pump every single gallon that they have a right to pump, and not a gallon more. And so while that's oversimplified, I think we really strive to do that. But we also come up with a 5-year accounting for our diversion, so that allows those producers that flexibility to say, I want to grow a water-intense crop, corn. We grow some of the best alfalfa in the world, comes out of the Pecos Valley. Pretty water-intense crop. So if you have to, because it's dry like it's been, and pump a little more, maybe on that 4th year, you take out that alfalfa and you plant cotton. And so you stay within your total diversion. And for agriculture, it works really well. Our penalty system, if you over divert in that 5-year accounting period, you have to pay it back ×2 out of your next allocation. And so there's a built-in mechanism that helps those producers say, you know what, I've got to pay attention to what that meter's saying and not over divert. Now, it doesn't work as well when you get into some of the other uses. If you've got an opportunity to sell some really expensive water to the oil patch and it's a one-time deal, they're going to frack this well, you over divert your entire you cannot pump the next 10 years and it doesn't matter because you made enough money on that one shot. So it doesn't work as well in that context, but I just think there was a lot of those kind of things that my board and previous boards have laid the groundwork for us to be successful. So I could literally talk all day on that, so I'll stop now.
Well, we'll get some wisdom from you in just a second. So this is a great transition into, Dawn, can you provide us with wisdom as the title of the panel suggests? What do you want to leave us with in a couple of minutes in terms of things that we can take and apply in Texas?
Well, I think as you move forward, maybe in looking at things that maybe Texas may look at applying to its situation in permitting groundwater use, is that you look at the process. I mean, I think the process in Mississippi is a good process. It's just outdated. It needs to be flexible or more updated. As I mentioned, I mean, if we could just get at least something that is a more updated and timely process, I think it would work better for us. Something that is going to allow something in the law that would, I think, would allow for if you're going to, I don't know what if there is a fee structure in Texas or any idea of a fee structure where the state would be able to collect a fee for a permit in Texas, but if it is, to have a mechanism for a reasonable increase in that fee over time. I mean, the fee was set at $10 back in 1985, and it will never be able to change. And that is just an unbearable type situation. And so, but I think you need to have some type of situation that you can have a fee that is based on the reasonable cost
Right.
of implementing the program in Texas, a process that will actually allow the permitting process to work here, because when it comes down to it, that's gonna be where your users are going to be most concerned with, because that's where I get beat up all the time. People coming in saying, I need a permit, I need a permit, I need a permit. And they don't want to wait, 10 days, 2 weeks, a month, or whatever. They need it. They want to have it as expeditiously as possible. And so you need to be able to deliver it in as timely a manner as can reasonably be expected.
Great, thank you. Sarah, what about you? Can you give us just a few takeaways that we can have here in maybe just a couple minutes, if you don't mind?
Sure,
please?
sure. And I just noticed the teleprompter. My name's Sarah Houston, not Sarah Porter. I'm sure she's a wonderful lady, but I just want to put that out there. Yeah, I think something like a conversation like this where you're like learning from other areas is like such a critical thing you can do. A lot of us have like similar formations, similar, state politics. How do we kind of learn from others? Like that, I think, is an awesome thing you can always be doing. But I guess I'll really emphasize like education. Everybody in this room probably thinks about water way more often than the average human being. And a lot of people don't think about it. And so while like K-12 programming is really important, we try to emphasize like decision maker education and general public education. And so we have some like social media programs. You have like a weekly Water Wednesday. It's like a little 1 to 2 minute video, something going on, everything from like, what is stormwater all the way up to the groundwater board fee structure, whatever. But that kind of thing, I think, kind of keeps the like beat in the drum, get people thinking about water. And especially, just with our decision makers, there's a lot, they have to think about all of the issues all of the time. And so how are we really reaching out to them, providing this kind of ongoing education? So when the time comes for some kind of a vote or whatever this decision might be, they've got some of this background knowledge, or they know you and they know they can call on you to be that expert and to be that source of information. So, I think education is just so critical to build into our programming and our goals.
Great, thank you. All right, Aron, give us a couple takeaways that we can apply to moving forward for Texas.
I will echo what Sarah said about, I think it's important that you be high profile, that you get out there and tell your story and be willing to point out the warts and what didn't work and what you're going back and revisiting. And then something I spend way too much time thinking about is as we go forward, I mentioned we're on a prior appropriation system. We're looking at a forecast that says we're going to have to reduce our depletions. And again, that's why I like prior appropriation doctrine. That is a giant stick that says if you don't fix this, this is how the state will fix it. So it's forced my district to think ahead and say, okay, if we don't want that outcome, what can we do? And in my mind, the only way you're going to take less water is to use less water, and the only way you're going to use less water is to go buy that water. And so that puts us back to a willing buyer, willing seller scenario. If we can acquire some water rights to offset those inflows that aren't happening, I think that's a fair and correct way to move forward. And so it's not cheap and it's not easy, but it beats the alternative. So that high profile and thinking ahead would be my takeaway.
Wonderful, thank you. Adam, do we have a minute or two for some questions?
We only have one question, or time for one question,
Okay,
and
perfect.
one actually came through, so
Okay.
I'll read it, and it's for Sarah.
What about 2 questions?
Oh, Dr.
What?
May. Oh, Dr.
He's like that.
All right. Come on, Robert. You'll get a treat with this one.
Right.
I get to cancel Ken Kramer. Forgive me if I missed it. I stepped out and Gary Westbrook waylaid me for a bit, but there was a U.S. Supreme Court case where Mississippi sued Tennessee, specifically the Memphis area, over groundwater production and Tennessee stealing Mississippi's water through a cone of depression. As I recall, the U.S. Supreme Court kind of remanded that maybe back down to appeals court. Is anything happening with that? And are y'all okay?
I could do a jump in, and then Dawn, you can follow up. But actually, the Supreme Court actually did rule on it. And so they found that groundwater is actually a shared resource and that the true remedy would be equitable apportionment. So it was kind of based on like surface water law in a lot of ways, where it's like Mississippi was suing for damages, and yes, the pumping in Memphis caused more of this groundwater migration to happen, but that was also the natural flow of the groundwater. So they were saying, okay, if you're really serious, like y'all need to get together and form a compact. That hasn't happened, so.
Okay. Thank you.
There hadn't been any further action on it.
Are you okay?
Well, I mean, we're not okay, but there hadn't been-
Mississippi did lose in there. They tried to argue that they own the groundwater, I believe, of my understanding.
Mi-
So
mi-
they tried to
Mississippi-
follow Texas and it didn't work. So
Yeah, Mississippi tried to argue they own the groundwater, and they sued for $656 million in damages, and they didn't prevail. So
you want to take that other question, or we can be out in the hall as well. I know we talked
Yeah.
about that. You bet. Oh, so
Yeah,
this
they'll be out
our-
in the hall if y'all want to ask them any additional questions. So
bet.
let's give them a huge round of applause.